in the Army, you're a pogue. In the Marines, you're a crayon eater. The Air Force is, I can remember Chair Force, but like what would be the equivalent in the Air Force if you're a pogue? I mean, in the Navy, you're a squid, right?
I thought
I don't
Crane Eater was just a description for all Marines.
Yeah.
I don't
Or,
think to my recollection, I don't think the Air Force has one like that because
That's
yeah.
they're
because
all
they're all
basically the
pogues.
same. I mean, yeah, exactly. I mean, we have some warfighters like pararescue and combat controller, and there's some specialized security forces units that are trained in like mount and all that other stuff. But for the most part, the majority of the Air Force is not a warfighter, like in the context of like infantry kind of stuff.
Just think of the Air Force as like corporate warfighters. Like
Yeah,
they'll
well,
ruin your day. They just do it in a very bureaucratic
dude,
manner.
even our dress blues are business. Like they're
Yep.
not even cool. It's just a blue suit with ribbons on it. I hate it. I still have mine, but I absolutely hate it.
I mean, they will ruin your day. But then I was thinking, like, okay, if those are the names, like, what's the Space Force call themselves? Vacuum suckers?
Ah, I was gonna say
Who
void
knows?
munchers, but
Void
vacuum
munchers. There you
suckers.
go. That's even better.
I've heard people say that pogue stands for person other than grunt, but I never got that in when I was in the Army. I don't think the origin of it is that clear.
hmm I met a person whose last name was Pogue once, and I realized it was not long after I'd gotten out, and I immediately like laughed when she told me her last name, and she's like, "What?" I was like, "Pogue." She's like, "What? What does it mean?" Like, I'm like, well, it means a I don't know, a like whatever, a person who sucks. And I couldn't even
It means a
articulate.
rimp. It means a
Yeah, I know,
rimp.
Rich. Like Rip
Yeah.
is easily articulated, but it was just funny. It was one of those moments where I was like, oh, we can't communicate about this.
You heard of you heard the term pokey bait, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, did Josh hear Pokey Bait? Like Pokey Bait's,
Pokey bait is like
I
candy.
yeah. And cough drops
Basically,
are private candy.
it, it's a
yeah.
it's a thing where it's something that a pogue would eat.
Mhm.
I was in the infantry and I had a third ammo pouch on my LBE that
Mhm.
I kept nothing but pokey bait in.
Yep.
So when we were doing road marches, I'd be popping starburst out of this third ammo pouch.
Well, when I went through basic, I have vivid memories of working on the chow line, and our captain was this ranger guy, super skinny, he looked like Skeletor. The commander comes through the line, and I tried to give him some Twinkies. He's like, "Private, that shit will make you fat and slow." And I still think about that all the time whenever I go to eat a Twinkie or some other donut. It's like, you were right, Commander. Anyway,
Drop troopers fall through an endless sky. Military sound and science fiction contest. Reaction to the system on fire. Military sound and science fiction contest. Short stories every Wednesday. Military sound and fiction contest. Discussion, interviews, reviews, and rants. Military science fiction contest.
welcome to the Military Science Fiction Podcast. We are four veterans, although we're missing our friend Jeffrey Haskell this morning, who are crazy enough to become writers. And we're here to talk about what makes great military SF, the greatest niche within a niche of any fiction, more niche than the Coast Guard or the Space Force. On board is Rick Partlow, author of more than 60 novels, including Contact Front and the Drop Trooper series. Jeffrey H. Haskell, who's not here with us, but author of the Grimm's War series. Joshua Hayes, author of the Valor series and operations manager and head thriller acquisitions editor for Aethon Books. And I'm James S. Aaron, author of the Aeon 14 Sentience Wars series and Galactic Law series. Between the four of us, we bring more than 100 novels written, although most of that is Rick. More than 30 years of publishing experience. Let's see, we've also been officer and enlisted, and we'd probably be retired by now if any of us had stuck around. So join our Discord to complain about the show and tell us everything we get wrong. Today, we want to talk about hard SF and military SF, which came out of some conversations about what makes military SF different than space opera with military characters. This is a very niche subject if we're getting like super niche, but I think the thing that we kind of started off with is what really makes very believable military SF. And Rick, do you want to kick it off when you think about what, like when a reader gets oriented in one of your novels, what are some things that you do from setting up the situation to describing the character, to how the characters interact with the world, to the equipment they use to really make this very clear it's military SF and a military SF reader is going to appreciate it?
Well, the equipment to me is not as important as I guess the lifestyle, the way the people live, the way they think. That's more how I'd set up realistic military SF. But as far as the equipment does go, I don't think it's important whether it's something more closer to what we have now that's just extrapolated out, or if it's something way out there like a gravity gun or plasma blast or whatever. As long as people treat it the way military people today treat their equipment. I think that the idea that, yeah, this isn't magic, you have to do PMCS on it, you have to, clean it, you have to make sure that it's running right. If it takes ammo, you have to make sure your ammo is topped up. As long as you treat it like a military weapon and not magic, then I think that you're taking a step towards making it realistic military science fiction.
Yeah, I think there's professionalism is a word that occurs to me when you're kind of describing that. Like people who, like whatever the weapon system is, be it like a sonic weapon or a ballistic weapon, like they're approaching it in a systematic, professional way. Like they know what it does, they know what its capabilities and limitations are, and they know how to employ it. And if that's the difference between somebody who just, picks up a pistol and fires wildly, like they don't know how to use that weapon or employ it effectively.
Well, I look at it as the difference between, say, Aliens and Star Wars. In Star Wars, everybody can just pick up a blaster and they automatically know how to use it. I mean, Luke Skywalker in Star Wars was a kid on a moisture farmer who the only thing as far as I could tell, that he ever fired was that old rifle at Womp Rats. And
Right.
yet, when he was on the Death Star, he picks a blaster up from some stormtrooper and automatically knows how to use it and is just a death machine. Whereas in Aliens, when Ripley wanted to know how to use that M41, well, Hicks gave her a class on how to use the M41, and taught her what she needed to know. I think that's the difference between space opera and military science fiction.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, really kind of breaking down the differences in, I mean, specifically weapon types, since we're on that subject right now, but like talking about Aliens, like they had the rifle, and then they had the pistol, and then they had those body mounted guns that were basically the squad automatic weapons. And
what do they call those things again?
I can't
Smart
remember.
guns, I think, or something. I can't remember.
I don't remember, but I remember thinking the ammunition system of that weapon was interesting because when they were collecting all of the magazines, when they said they couldn't fire under the whatever power converters or whatever they were,
Fusion reactor.
Fusion reactor.
It's
They
called the
collected,
smart gun.
they ejected all the magazines from their rifles and were like handing over magazines. And then in these big guns, they just disconnected these two things and handed over like some kind of relay unit. It was not a magazine in the same way that I think of magazine. Because then, most squad automatic weapons are, well, typically speaking, they're belt fed. Like
These were drum fed, and I think that's the reason, like, pragmatic way, they couldn't hand over the magazines because it's like a huge drum. And
and that's what I'm saying. Like that even though that wasn't a topic that they talked about or explained in the movie, they still portrayed the weapon as a different system that needed to be treated differently.
Yeah.
And in Star Wars, all the blasters both basically work the same, right? You pick them up and you pull the trigger. And the only difference that I have ever seen on any blasters in that universe was in Rogue One, where the one Oriental guy had the backpack, and he had the cables, and it was basically a automatic weapon, but it was an automatic blaster, but he had that backpack on, and so functionally it was a little different. But that's like one of the things I try to do in mine is, even though it's probably not accurate in terms of technology speaking, I try to relate it as close as I can to modern day weapons, in that they have a limited capacity most of the time, or there's some type of um, restriction on what they can do. You know, can you fire it? If you fire it at full auto, does the battery pack run out of power faster? Do they carry extra battery packs on them? Does the barrel overheat? Those kind of like functional things that you know, even in modern day movies, sometimes you see people firing like I don't know, an HK, and they fire 100 rounds and never change the magazine. Like, and a lot of that, like John Wick does it really well, but a lot of that stuff can add significantly to the tension of the scene
Right.
if you put in place these restrictions, and then you have to deal with, what do I do if I have to change a mag? What do I do if the, you know, the weapon misfires or something like that? And
One of the universally acclaimed as one of the best gunfights ever put on film is the bank robbery scene from Heat.
100%.
And they do that. I mean, they make a big deal of that. They have them switching out magazines. In fact, they even do it the right way with an M16, where most movies they'll slingshot the charging handle, but they have the people using the bolt release to load a new
Yep.
round, that which
Mhm.
most movies don't do.
Well,
And
and
so
they did
you
it
can- you can
accurate.
do-
They did it accurately there too, where it wasn't just pushing the bolt release; it was slapping it with your hand, just
Yeah.
because they fundamentally, you know, a lot of people, even when I see some movies do it, they tap it with their finger, and I'm like, you don't have the muscle control for that. All your
Right.
fine motor skills are gone. So slapping it with your hand is and that's why they say, like, for Glocks, for instance, and a lot of magazine, or a lot of weapon systems that don't have double action, where you see them reloading the weapon and then they hit the release, but it's not actually a release. It's just the slide lock, but they're using it as a release. But in actual combat situations, you wouldn't hit that release with your thumb. You just yank back on the slide to get it to reset, because you don't have the fine motor control to activate it with your thumb.
Not unless you've done a lot of training.
For sure, but I mean, even in most situations, I think even seasoned operators like special forces or whatever, that's how they train. It's just a more
I
fundamental
think
way
there's
to
a
do
problem
it.
with things that look cool in, you know, visual medium, that if people know better, I mean, that's where, you know, in telling a story, you can have the character, you know, kind of fight with that, battle with it, like what they know about it and how they respond to the weapon, and what, like, you know, as you both were talking, I was thinking it's constraints and limitations that create drama, right? And so the more competent the character is, for me anyway, like one of the things I hate is when a character is incompetent in using a weapon. Like, I like to see a character who is highly competent using a weapon, understanding its limitations, and because there's all kinds of other things you can do there, like, you know, I remember we had to hand back our M60s, and so we all had to transition to 249s and 50 cals, and so then we were constantly, you know, bitching about how what the 50 cal did well and what the 249 did well, that we missed the 60,
You
and
didn't get the 240s.
we did not at the time, and so that was like but understanding what those weapons were for, but like, you know, that was a big problem when you take a 50 cal, like a 50 cal as a convoy operations, you know, cover weapon. Okay, sure, it's kind of scary, but like you think of all the follow-on effects, and you get there's, just speaking of training, like you were, Josh, like you get a person who's freaked out, you know, in the open on top of a 5-ton with a 50 cal, they'll just light up a neighborhood, you know, just destroy
Yeah,
the top of a building. And
for
but
sure.
that's what they were trained to do, because you're trained to, you know, to walk the 50 cal, but then even if you're trying to like avoid fire, I don't know, but those are all things I think are interesting to me when I see somebody interact with a weapon, and as the author being very clear and setting up like what the capabilities and limitations are, like what the character knows about it. And then even I'm thinking about it in terms of like gameplay and the way you know, you've got progression through a story. Like, you know, in Halo you start out with the pistol, and they kind of made a mistake where the pistol is one of the most OP weapons in Halo if you learn to use it.
Right.
But you immediately want to like progress to the machine gun and the and the rocket launcher, but then you come back and are good at the pistol. But I don't know. I think those things create like open up new opportunities in a story, and there's always the learning process, and you can set up like with the training scene, like Rick was just talking about. It's kind of like you set up tension because we're teaching a person about the weapon, and now we're going to go into like use the weapon and everything that we talked about during the training scene, as far as why this weapon sucks or is good or watch out for this. Now we can show the reader how this is working, right? And I think all those things work towards believability. For me anyway. Like I just hate it when a character, like you were saying in Star Wars, like the weapon is like magic. They just pick it up and use it, and it doesn't actually, like, I think a weapon or the way you use it can build character because you're demonstrating competency, you're like building out like how the story works and the world works, and all that happens through how that tech is executed. So I really like it when people do that well. Um I'm even here just looking at like for aliens, like they made so many types of like just realistic looking guns for this movie, which is just pretty kick ass. And the way they approached it, um, I think really built that world, um, more so than other movies.
Yeah, and I think too, like a lot of the existing technology that they're using for advanced combat operations now is really cool. Like something that's been out for several years is the corner look around or the corner
Mhm.
device that you can you're still holding the gun like you would normally hold it, but the barrel is canted
Yeah.
or turned, and then there's a screen that kind of projects the aiming reticle so you can see where it's at, and you're literally shooting around a corner, but you're aiming the weapon. And I try to do some of that stuff in my books. I try to. It's really hard, especially in far future military sci-fi, to like go over the top and make your guns completely OP. But I tend to try to think in terms of it doesn't matter how advanced the technology is, you still got to deal with the people using it. And
Right.
so if the weapon is too advanced, then your characters aren't going to have anything to do. They can just push a button and things will happen. And so I try to kind of constrain some of the technology so that it still requires character action because I think that's the
Mhm.
most important thing. um and even with like auto aim, which is some of the things that I've put into weaponized is their internal targeting systems can sync with the weapon and they can use that. But to counter that, there's
Right.
jamming and different environmental concerns that are taken into account and all of that stuff. And so they're, even with the kind of advanced technology they're using, I'm still cognizant to really put fair amount of restrictions on them, because for every advance that you have in weapons technology, there's always going to be somebody out there that's trying to counter that uh, technological advance. So there's always going to be something to kind of fight over.
Well, also, one thing that I've come across is weapons will have shortcomings, but
Mhm.
they have to fit certain like mission purposes. Like for instance, in Drop Trooper, the drop troopers, they have this plasma gun that it's got enormous limitations in that it's short ranged and it takes a couple of seconds to recycle.
Mm.
So it's kind of slow firing. But they were in the drop trooper suits are a mobile uh, battle platform, and usually they're far away from resupply because they're dropped, on a city like paratroopers, and you have to be able to operate independently for hours, maybe even a day before you can get resupply. So they couldn't saddle them with a weapon system like a coil gun where you shoot through your whatever 100 rounds and then you got to be reloaded, and with a weapon system that's 9 feet tall and there's no infantry attached to it, nobody's there to reload it for you, and you aren't carrying spare. You have to get out of the suit and reload the thing. So it had to be something that they could use without having to reload or rearm for hours at a time. And that meant that they had to deal with the shortcomings of that weapon
Mhm.
because it was the best they could do. Whereas like a regular dismount, you know, Force Recon Marine in those books, they have what they call a Gauss rifle, which is like a miniature coil gun.
Right.
And, you know, they use magazines, they reload it. When they're empty, but they also, you know, they're a smaller target. They're not as mobile, so they're more likely to be in one position and stay in that area for a while and get resupply. So that
I think that's a lot of logistics is a lot of things that
Yeah.
I think
Right.
are kind of overlooked a lot of times, especially when dealing in, you know, large scale combat operations in general, but especially like last week we were talking about like small unit tactics and special forces and that kind of thing. But when you're looking at the immense distances involved, and, you know, even if your ship is in orbit, say, that ship is still going to have limitations on how much spare ammunition, how much spare food, like all that kind of stuff. But then also the logistics involved in getting it to the troops. You're still going to have to, do you have a drop ship or a shuttle? Then you're going to have to deal with anti-air and fuel or whatever you're using there. And a lot of those things kind of get overlooked, especially when a lot of futuristic stories feature ships that, you know, kind of like aircraft carriers where they have nuclear power generators that will go for, you know, 20, 50, 75 years or whatever it is now. They kind of extrapolate that and make all of their craft have just an infinite power supply, and
Right.
so it doesn't put any limitations on anything. And I think again, just to go kind of beat a dead horse, limitations are the key to any, I think, realistic military sci-fi in terms of equipment, just because that's true no matter what unit, no matter where you're at, no matter what time period. Going back to through Earth's history or even projecting into the future, there's always going to be logistical limitations on that kind of stuff. And those are very interesting issues to tackle if tackled the right way. I mean, obviously, you can be super boring about it. But, you know, if you're in the middle of a, you know, like Rick said, you've got a couple hours of firefighting going on and you're getting to the sixth or seventh hour, and now you're running low on ammo, you're running low on water, you're running low on medical supplies. Like all of these things kind of stack up and just ramp up the tension instead of just having, you know, huge big battles. Well, oh, there's more enemies coming. There's more enemies coming. Okay. But it's kind of like Starship Troopers in that the movie where they're just like against thousands and thousands of these bugs, and they're just standing on the parapet shooting down, like just waylaying them. And they're like, why would they even hold that? Like there's no way that they could hold enough ammunition to fight off that force in any effective manner. I mean, it was cool to watch.
Plus, they didn't have air support or artillery because it was a crappy movie.
Yeah, for sure, for 100%. Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing that gets boring to me about the John Wick movies, actually, is I just get really tired of watching him reload and just shoot people in the head. Like, okay, I get the gun fu thing, but that, to me, you're right. That tension of what's going on inside the character's head as they, you know, deal with the limitations of their weapon system. I mean, I don't know. To me, that's what is a professional soldier, you know, is like they understand everything about how this is going to work and how much time they have and what they have to deal with. That is really interesting to me. I don't know. And then also sometimes you can kind of tell like what the author's experience is, because they thinking about the big picture, you know, when it comes to that. Like, do they, somebody that can kind of have those details about, do they think about the mechanics? Do they think about the logistics? You know, do they give time to the reloaders? Or is it just kind of like cowboy stuff and those people don't exist? Like, to me, I really enjoy that kind of thing because I think those people win wars. So that's a detail I always
Like you said, the big picture, that means the author is thinking about things other than the battle.
Right.
And, you know, you can go too far into the weeds with certain aspects of it. And, you know, we always talk about fun over realism in some situations, and reader enjoyment in some situations. So there could be moments or considerations given to this scene is important for this reason, and that reason doesn't include the logistical limitations of
Right.
what they're doing. And so it might not be necessary to dive deep into it. It could just say, oh, we're running low on ammo, and just leave it at that, and not even discuss how they're going to get reloaded or how they're going to get resupplied or anything like that. It's
Consistency
just,
is also important when it comes to that, though. You
yeah,
can't have them go for like hours and hours without even thinking about ammo in one battle, and then the next battle, it's been a few minutes, like, oh, we're running low on ammo. Why
for
were we
sure.
running low on ammo last time?
Right. Exactly. Well, and you know, I think what is the common loadout now? Well, when I was in for what I did, my common loadout was 180 rounds, and from everything that I've seen in terms of special forces operations or like say Marine combat operations, it's anywhere from between 180 to 210 to like 240, I think.
It's
Yeah,
210 when
depending
we were
on,
in 3 magazines and 2 magazine pouches, and one in the weapon, 30
yeah,
rounds each.
because more than that, you start getting really, I mean, you're wearing a whole bunch of gear anyway, and more than that, you
Yeah.
start kind of overloading yourself.
Stuff's heavy.
But how fast can you go through a 30 round magazine when you're firing it on full auto, and you know, a couple of seconds, and then you're already reloading and going through magazines. And um you know, in weaponized, they don't use physical projectiles. It's kind of like a pulse uh laser bolt or whatever. I call it a pulsar, but you know, a lot of those restrictions come from battery power.
Mhm.
And you know, I think in terms of, I still want them to functionally uh like change out magazines and make it kind of realistic in that. So I put limitations on the battery packs. Like if you're firing it at a certain strength, then your battery pack will last longer. If you're firing so many rounds, your battery pack will last this amount of time. And I don't really go too technical into that, but I I try to maintain it, like Rick said, a little bit of consistency, where if they're in an extended firefight, how often are they going to have to change out batteries, and can you recharge them after the fact, and this and that. So, you know,
One
it's
of the
just, I think, go
Yeah.
ahead, Rick.
I say one of the I like the idea of having a beam weapon that's constrained by some kind of a magazine change thing. One
Mhm.
of my favorite things that I introduced, and I forget where I got it from because I didn't invent it, but that I introduced way back in beginning of the Birthright universe, well before Drop Trooper, like way back in the beginning, was something I called the pulse pulse laser weapons, where they use a cartridge that's like hyper explosive chemical cartridge, and you put it in a magazine. It blows up inside of a chamber, and it feeds the heat through a lasing rod and
Mhm.
creates a laser. And it's focused out of a crystal in the front of it. So you have to change magazines just like a pistol or submachine gun or rifle. So, but it's kind of cool. And also, I stole this directly from Steve Jackson, the Gatling laser, that where it's basically a Vulcan cannon that uses those cartridges.
Uh-huh.
You know,
Yeah, that's cool.
The Vulcan. Yeah, I think,
but
well, I think the cool thing about
it gives
that
you
is,
something kind of futuristic,
yeah, you're
but
combining
also,
something futuristic
yeah.
with something people understand, you know, which is the change of a magazine and the, you know, Gatling configuration and things like that.
I can't remember which book I used it in, but I used, actually, I don't even think I wrote this book. The idea was an idea I was working on for what was that thing that keystroke we were going to do a long time ago? James, you wrote
Nova
Oh,
Blue.
the Law
yeah,
Universe.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
my Star Bounty
right.
series came out of that.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. Well, one of the concepts I came up with that in terms of firearms was crystals, and
Yeah,
how different crystals can emit different types of uh beams or powers of beams, and at some point in time those crystals break down, and depending on what beam you have or crystal you're using, will determine how much power the energy the weapon is using. And I thought that was kind of cool, just in terms of
I wrote the first book in that series with all the constraints that you put for Nova Blue,
yeah.
which afterwards, when you decided not to do it, I had to write the other 3 books, and I'm like, I'm stuck with all this technology.
Nice.
Well, that was cool because it
Nice.
combined like economics with the weapon, you know, the kind of capabilities of the energy source, you know, so which I think is an important thing to think. You know, we've talked about other constraints, but um oftentimes war just comes down to what a country can afford, right? So like I think
For
thinking
sure.
about those things and tying that together can really build your realism. Another thing I wanted to get your thoughts on was terrain, because a lot of times I don't. I mean, in the army, like we spend a lot of time thinking about terrain, range cards, you know, reconnaissance. Like a lot of times it feels like authors don't focus as much on terrain and its effect on the mission. Um, what are your thoughts about that, and how much time do you spend thinking about it when you're kind of writing, you know, developing a story?
In terms of thinking about it while I'm writing, I tend to think about it in 2 ways. One, what would it look like from the soldier's perspective on the ground? But also, what does it look like from an aerial kind of reconnaissance platform, and how do you meld the two?
Mhm.
Um, and one of the things that I came to a kind of a weird realization on landscaping a couple of years back was I was trying to figure out, like, why do people put like berms around housing developments? And one of the things is that it reduces sound, but it
Mhm.
also interrupts sight lines. And
Mhm.
so from the ground, you can't see
It
through it.
makes it
And
defensible when the zombies attack.
Right.
100%. Uh, because I was thinking about, you fly over a city in a plane and it looks significantly different perceptually, I think that's a word, that than it looks on the ground. And that's
I'll
a
allow
big,
it.
yeah, thank you. That's a big thing when you are, doing like basically helicopter flight operations, is that it looks significantly different from the air than it looks on the ground, even if you're looking at the same thing. And um, so I try to incorporate those differences, and there's a lot of present day fiction that do this very well, because it's just kind of documented how the ground combat operators communicate what they need to air units. And it's different, between them and air units, and like, say, like mortar teams that are stationary and they're working off grid coordinates or whatever. But, they have to say, this is the building, you know, 2 blocks away from the smoke to the north, and it's got, some kind of description, and in terms of terrain, I try my hardest to put everybody in a more urban setting than a rural countryside setting. Just because, for me anyway, it's easier to direct the action and to create choke points and uh, obstacles in that kind of a setting. Whereas, if you've got powder armor or mechs or whatever, and they're in a big open field, there's not a lot of obstacles that you need to deal with in terms of dramatic storytelling. Like, there could be a river or a wadi or something that you need to negotiate like that. But for me anyway, it doesn't present a lot of functional challenges that the reader can easily take in and see. Even in a lot of books that I write, I can't see what the author is trying to describe. For instance, they're talking about going down a hill and a tree over here or a valley here or whatever. I don't see any of that. And maybe some readers do, but I definitely don't see it the way
I
the
have a hard
author is
time
portraying it.
with it too. Like it, depending on what a depression, you know, they reach the edge of the depression, they peak, you know, over the cover. Like sometimes I think about it in terms of like you're on the ground, low crawl, like the thing that's directly in front of you and the thing that might
Hmm.
be, you know, providing cover or concealment. but it is hard to get that kind of medium view of things, you know.
Yeah.
And I have a hard time thinking of people that do it really well. Actually, it's
Right.
I read a book
Well,
called Matterhorn that was about these guys, about Vietnam. These guys just keep taking the same hill over and over again. And he did a pretty good job of describing that. And the mountain, actually, the hill, like, evolves over time as they basically just destroy all the vegetation. But even that was like very close. Like they're low crawling from point to point. You know, and he also oriented on individuals in the squad. And so that was about the only thing you could really kind of tell was in relation to the crest of the hill.
Hmm.
If we had an OP, you know, and orienting on that, but being able to tell individually what was happening. And he also spent a lot of time on the range cards and describing what was in a, you know, different machine guns field of view and things like that. But it was still, even with all that effort, it was hard to tell exactly what it was supposed to look like.
I think that a lot of the combat and a lot of boilerplate military science fiction is still fighting Vietnam.
Yeah.
Um, and I make a point in most of my books that for the most part, people aren't fighting out in the countryside because there's nothing there worth fighting over. They're fighting for strategic points in cities. They're fighting for like in um, defense laser systems, fusion reactors, uh, air air filtration if it's like in a space station, or water sources, something that's a key point that they need to have to control a population center. So there's not a lot of out in the field, you know, like the stuff when I was in the army when we're like going behind the hill and going, you know, and no, it's all urban
Right.
fighting. If it's not in the city, then it's trying to get into the city. And there's also a lot of difference between, like, I wrote different books, one with a regular dismount force recon force that's like going through the streets of a city, and another one with these battle suit guys who are basically hopping from block to block because they got jets that let them go short distance. And the way that they looked at a battlefield was totally different.
Mm.
And also the way they looked at cover and concealment was totally different. Because if you're
Yeah.
just one dismount, you know, with regular body armor and a coil gun rifle that doesn't have much of a thermal signature, you can get away with hiding. You can use buildings and in like vehicles for cover and concealment. If you're in a 9-foot tall battle suit that has a nuclear reactor inside of it, basically, that's putting out heat like you wouldn't believe, and is firing a high signature plasma cannon. Well, there is no such thing as concealment, and there is really
Right.
no such thing as cover, because the people shooting at you are going to be using, you know, guided heat, you know, heat guided missiles, beam weapons that can blow right through buildings. So your only defense is movement, which is why they keep hopping from place to place in the city.
Hmm.
So it's a totally different mindset from one. I don't want to say combat arm. I guess they are kind of different combat arms to another in science fiction. And if you're somebody who's in like an armored vehicle, it'd be different too. So,
Yeah, no, and I like, I know you have mechs in your stories. I have something like mechs in my series on Tranquility. But the fighting's not only the logistics of fighting, but the actual fighting styles change too. And when you're operating a machine that is that big, you have to talk about like speed restrictions, or you know what happens if you get overwhelmed. Like in Tranquility, they're fighting um, basically what amounts to uh, alien. Well, they're kind of you could equate them to like the bugs in Starship Troopers, but I designed them more off of the Zerg from StarCraft, and so they're not using technology. It's just, you know, throwing meat at the grinder basically. But when you've got one mech and, you know, 100 alien creatures that are swarming you, the defense it kind of goes out the window. Like there's not a whole lot you can do. Like you can sweep your cannon around and blast a couple of them, but you get swarmed. Then what are you going to do? And I came up with a total field, like electrical field kind of thing that they can hit as kind of a last resort that, emits a like a high pulse energy field that, shocks everything that's on them, but that also drains a lot of their suit's power too. I like, again, I'm an over restrictor when it comes to that kind of stuff. But I really, really don't like giving my characters OP technology. And I probably place too much restrictions and limitations on stuff that they do, just because I think it's just interesting to see
Right.
the characters overcome those limitations.
I mean,
Well, I have mechs in one of my the wholesale slaughter series, but honestly, I find mechs a little bit ridiculous as actual weapons of war because they're such big targets.
Mhm.
So like in the drop trooper series, the only mechs that you encounter are the bad guys, the Tawny. They have mechs and they only use them as like basically mobile artillery platforms that are back behind the front lines with a bunch of missiles and rail guns and all that kind of stuff that they have a lot of infantry guarding them.
One trope
So
that
they're like M155s.
yeah.
Good, I'm sorry.
No, I was thinking about the like objectives and where you choose to place the battle. Because one trope I always kind of like is almost like a World War I scenario where people have trained to fight a certain way and think things are going to play out a certain way. And then they slam up against like a shift in technology, right? So we might all meet out in the open field to fight and think things are going to work this way. And then the characters quickly have to realize that like, nope, this isn't going to work. And now we got to adjust our thinking. And you might have a politician or someone else that like sets up the initial encounter and gives the order to do it a certain way. And that's why you could place them in a place like like a forest or rolling countryside or something like that. But then it could shift, and that can be part of your kind of try fail cycle in the story, that you see the weapon systems or the characters fail in a certain scenario, and then you can move them to another one where you can see them then win or learn to use the equipment they have to to accomplish their mission. Because I think that's the other thing, like as we look at realism, it's that your characters aren't, I'm thinking about the same thing with mechs, like the ways that Apaches and Chinooks were used in Afghanistan. Like you might think you have a thing that is OP in certain certain scenarios, and then terrain comes to play, and now like a Chinook, which would rule heavy lift in various places, can barely deliver anything to the top of a mountain in Afghanistan. But you can see those things play out as you kind of set up different battles and different scenarios in the story.
I can't remember if we talked about this on one of the episodes. I remember talking about it at some point, but Operation Red Wing, there was an interview with one of the Apache pilots that was in it, and he had to tell the Blackhawks to slow down
Right.
because he could not go fast enough because the air was so thin where they were at that his Apache couldn't maintain speed. And when you think about an Apache as like a fast attack helicopter, and then a Blackhawk is just it's a fast helicopter, but you wouldn't in your mind think a Blackhawk could outrun an Apache. Like that just doesn't make sense. But in the terrain and the altitude that they were at, because of the Blackhawk's airframe, it was able to maintain a faster speed. And I
The
love that
Blackhawk
kind
or
of
the
stuff.
Chinook?
Well, there were Chinooks there, but there were Blackhawks that were
Because they had the
going
Navy
with
Seahorses, right? Those are that's a Blackhawk platform.
Yeah,
Seahorse?
Or
from
Sea
what I
Stallion, Sea,
if
what
I
is that one?
Sea Stallion. I
it's a
think.
Sea
Stallion.
Stallion, but the
Seahorse.
Sea Stallion's not a Blackhawk, it's something else. But
Is the Sea
from what I
Stallion the
understand
same
from
thing
the
as a Pavlo?
yes question mark, I think so. But from what the way that he described it,
Mhm.
it sounded like he was going with Blackhawks and they were taking a quick reaction force there.
Mhm.
And the Chinooks were there, but the Chinooks were 1/60th and they were separate, and because they were on different channels, they couldn't talk to each other. And so, as far as I understand it, I guess I could be wrong. Tell me about it if I
No,
if I
you're
am in
right.
the
I just
comments or
I remember
in
hearing that.
Discord.
Yeah, the Sea Stallion is the CH53,
Yep,
which is the
Sikorsky.
same body as the Pavlo.
Yeah.
I don't know what the rare version of the Blackhawk is.
They've got a couple of them. I actually bought. I loved his story so much, and I love helicopters so much. I bought a model of the UH-60. It's just the base
nice.
model. It's not the Special Forces model.
It's just called the Seahawk, I found out.
Mm.
So the Navy Blackhawk is the Seahawk. It's kind of unimaginative, if you ask me.
Ah. Well, that comes up with a good maybe a point that we can cover real quickly is naming conventions for weapons
it takes so much of my freaking time as a writer, man.
Yeah.
That might be
I honestly I keep it.
That might be a good place to break, because I think we're almost at an hour, and that could be sounds like a subject for
maybe talk about that later.
Yeah, another how do you name things, which I think also gets your world building and
not just name things, but in the Army there's like a certain convention, but in the military in general, certain convention for like helicopters. They all have Native American names in the Army, and then in the Air Force you've got fighters that are named after birds,
right.
And then the bombers are named after something else. It's so you have to like have a convention that makes sense with whatever service you're going with. So you're talking about one final thing though. You're talking about how we're fighting the last war, like in World War I with the trenches and everything. And I have dealt with that a little bit, specifically in the Holy War series I wrote, which is like the earliest chronologically in that universe. They're fighting a war with the tactics they've been using against like pirates and bandits, and smugglers, with small, short range warships like fighters. And then they try to go out and fight an interstellar war with these things. But these fighters are short range. They have limited reaction mass. Their weapons have limited ammo. They're like current fighters, they can only go so far without refueling. They can only fire off so many weapons and then they're done. And that worked fine when you're very close to resupply. But then they wound up in another star system, and they're over here, going into orbit around this planet, chasing some enemy ship, and the resupply is over here, like millions of miles away, and it's going to take them hours to get to each other. So you've got a bunch of fighters, they do their mission, and now they're out of reaction mass, and they're drifting, and you have to get the base ship, whatever it is, to them before they go too far, and you can't reach them, or they run out of water, or run out of power. So they had to totally change the way they fought the war, and that goes from that war to the next one, where, like in Drop Trooper, where they have to change tactics again because they were still fighting the last war, and the enemy changed the way they were fighting.
I think that
it's easier for me to do.
Really interesting.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, that's one of the tropes I love, I guess. I don't know, when you go out thinking things are going to be one way and they don't work that way.
It's easier for me to deal with that with like ship to ship battle than it is on the ground. I guess I'm at a point, I'm looking at the technology that we have, and that's the hard thing about writing military science fiction, with the exception of things like superconductors and the power that goes into like the body armor, the battle suits, like these little isotope reactors. With the exception of that, everything that I'm writing is stuff that we're going to already have or will have within the next 10 or 15 years. And it's hard to keep ahead of it because it's moving so fast.
For sure.
Yeah.
Especially if you start a series like Drop Trooper, where say you started like 6-7 years ago and our technology was at a a place here, and you're like, well, if I extrapolate this, I can project it this far and change these things, and then you're still writing it 5 years later, and the exponential growth in technology has now created something that wouldn't even be possible in your sci-fi universe based on different things.
I
And
started writing that universe back in the late 80s.
oh wow.
And I was using every cutting edge thing that I could grab from any speculative fiction, Aviation Week in space technology, anything, and just stuffing it into this one book. And it wasn't 20 years later when we had a lot of that stuff, not all of it, obviously. We're not going faster than light or putting computers in people's heads, although that is coming now.
Yeah.
And it's like I cannot keep ahead of it, no matter how hard I try. I had to basically work in a reset button with like a nuclear war that happened between now and then, just to keep, because otherwise it's not going to be predictable. I mean, you aren't going to be able to make anything that people aren't already going to have made.
For sure.
You had to nerf everybody and then start over again. That's awesome.
Basically.
Yep.
You got a level squish.
Yep. Yep. Cool. Well, thank you. This was a good conversation. I think if there's anything that you disagree with, hit us up in the Discord, and we'd love to talk more about it. But what makes a story believable for you? And then what are the things that throw you out of a story if an author like spends too much time on it or not enough, that immediately makes you think that, yeah, they didn't actually think about this very much? Or do you even care? We'd like to, I don't know, hear what you think about it. So thanks very much for hanging out with us, and we'll see you next time.
See you.
Lone up troopers on a hit and jump gate. Military science fiction podcast.